go.
Welcome into another episode of the College Football Insiders. Matt Zenitz is off the phone, so we can begin. My name is Richard Johnson. I'm joined by my guys, Chris Hummer, Matt Zenitz, aforementioned, and John Talty. Fellas, the coaching carousel has indeed begun spinning. UCLA and Virginia Tech entered the fray on Sunday. I thought you guys did a great emergency show about those two openings kind of in the fire there. When they first opened, you guys had all the bullets flying, and you guys conducted yourself with great aplomb, I will say, and did a great show. But let's reset and advance it now that we're a couple days in. You like that, didn't you, Matt? Now that we're a couple days in, let's reset and let's talk about where things are. And I think we should talk about overall more than anything else, the AD situations at play here that both potential new coaches will be stepping into. Whit Babcock had a press conference today to introduce new interim coach Phil Montgomery. And in that, before he introduced Montgomery, he mentioned that he will, and I quote, support and advise the hiring committee that's going to be headed by two trustees. They call them visitors at Virginia Tech, Board of Visitors members, who will be conducting the search from a search committee standpoint. He also mentioned, did Babcock, that there will be an NFL-type structure. Personally, my guess is that means a head coach general manager tandem, similar to what Oklahoma has at the head of their operation. Both of these things point to what I think is important when we talk about Virginia Tech, and we'll start with them before we talk about UCLA. There needs to be a ton of modernization at Virginia Tech. Everybody that I talk to, source-wise, mentions different versions of the word outdated or antiquated with Virginia Tech. They have to modernize as an athletic department. Chris, I'll go to you first. Where do you think this goes for Virginia Tech as far as the structure of this potential new coaching staff and athletic department?
Well, I will say the NFL model, and I put that in quotation marks, is kind of the rage for ADs right now. I think it's the thing that ADs tell their board. It's the thing that ADs tell their boosters that gets people excited. I don't want to say it like shows they're doing something, but it is like the mode of operation for ADs right now. It seems like to go this GM route, and like in some ways that makes sense. Like some schools are hiring GMs that are tied to the AD that don't necessarily oversee the head coach, but work in lockstep with the head coach to put the roster in the best position possible, and it creates more power for athletic directors who are at this point in college football severely outpaid by their football head coaches. So that's one way to think about it. But Virginia Tech specifically, like I would say, speaking of the word antiquated, they've been very far behind from a off-field staffing standpoint. There was about like a 3 or 4 month stretch this year where a personnel department at Virginia Tech basically didn't exist. Like no recruiting, no personnel staffers. They had been looking for a general manager for months and months and months before they finally hired one late this year. And I think that really put Virginia Tech in a difficult position going into the season from a scouting standpoint, from a portal evaluation standpoint, and everything else. I can't tell you why the wheels were stuck there for as long as they were, but they were definitely stuck. And it's something that people in that program and people outside of that program have brought up to me over and over and over going into this season. And I think we're seeing some of those results play out.
John, what do you think about kind of the way this is going with Virginia Tech? There's a lot of question marks about Whit Babcock and his handling of the situation overall with Brent Pry and sort of letting him and this goes back to the post Frank Beamer era, right? You know, it can be said that, quite frankly, Justin Fuente failed at Virginia Tech, certainly for a lot of reasons. But one of the main ones was, quite frankly, because Virginia Tech was too shackled to the past in Frank Beamer, and they were too stuck between eras, and they didn't really know how to transition forward, John.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think there's a couple things to think about here. One, I think to Chris's point, which is a really smart one, is that we don't know if that GM and coach model is going to work. We've seen a couple of it pop up, Stanford, Cal, Oklahoma. Like, we just don't know if that's like the right move. It's kind of interesting that so many people are so into it right now, the way ADs are. And it's kind of, we go through these phases where everybody feels like they have to do this one thing, and that's where that feels like right now. So we'll see, what comes of that. I think the more important thing related to that is I think Virginia Tech has to show it's willing to put real resources into the program. Richard, to your point earlier, talking to different people around the industry, they've made the point over and over again that they have not put the necessary resources to be successful. I think it speaks to some of the lack of staffing and personnel that they've had in the past. That they've had some NIL issues in the past as well. And so I think that when you think about how do you attract the right candidate, I think you're going to want to know, all right, am I coming in as a GM? Are we aligned in our vision? But also, am I going to have the resources to build the staff that I want, to hire the people that I need, to be able to go out and get the players that I need? To this point, Virginia Tech has not really shown that. And I think it's, like you said, kind of living some of that Beamer era. Hey, we're still going to get the best Tidewater kids and all that kind of stuff. And it hasn't really played out on the field. So that will be, I think, a big question mark when you think about as we get deeper into the process, when they start talking to potential candidates, they're going to want to know there's a real commitment to winning. And that means dollars. And I think if you can show that you have that, the path is still in the ACC feels open to people. But I think that's going to be a big question mark with Virginia Tech at this point.
Hey, quick question for y'all.
All that being said, Virginia Tech still, to me, the more attractive job out of the two, and more attractive than UCLA. And I think potential candidates would agree with that and probably feel the same. To transition to something else, as I'm sure has been the case for you guys also, have gotten a lot of questions the last couple of days. Who are going to be the top candidates? Who do you expect to end up there? Questions along those lines, which is normal going into this kind of process. And we will just throw out, it is so premature to make any sort of great guess on who is going to end up, not only as the next head coach at either of these two places, but who's even going to be the top candidates, especially when you factor in, like Richard brought up earlier, the fact that we don't even necessarily know who is going to be leading the way in terms of making the hire with the questions that are there with administration at both places.
I had a quick question, just kind of go back in time a little bit to the point that John was making earlier about investment. Y'all all talk to potential head coaching candidates. When you have those conversations with somebody asking if they're interested in a job, how many times do y'all hear the word alignment when they bring it up in terms of commitment and everything else? I know of coaches that pass on jobs every year, different situations, because they're worried about alignment. And alignment's going to be a big question at a place like Virginia Tech, which, to Richard's point, words like antiquated have come up. Like, coaches are going to want proof that that job is ready for them to be successful in. And you could definitely say the exact same thing about UCLA. I think both of these jobs have some legitimate questions to answer in that way to the best candidates, to the guys who have legitimate options. Like, you have to prove that alignment is there and the backing is there.
To your point, Chris, I think we're thinking of Auburn, Oklahoma as the Jackson Arnold Bowl, but I remember Brent Venables, I think, publicly used the word he didn't like the alignment at Auburn, which is why he ultimately pulled himself out of that search and eventually ended up at Oklahoma. So it's a huge thing. Everybody talks about it, and I think that we're going to keep getting into it. But the instability, maybe, I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, but the questions around who's making these hires, are these ADs on solid footing? That's a real factor, I think, in these situations. And also, there's been some changes. Maybe we'll get into it later, but UCLA has a new chancellor this year. That could change things. People think it might, or at least there's a possibility that it could change what they decide to do at football. That's a real factor in who those people are making the decisions.
Yeah, two names to note for Virginia Tech are Jay Pearson and Ryan McCarthy. They are two members of the Board of Visitors Board at Virginia Tech, and they will be tasked with doing this. Again, like I said, with Babcock, the athletic director, said, and I quote, "I will support and advise the committee." That is a telling point, I should say, about the nature of Virginia Tech's search. And as Matt said, they're on a little bit of a different timeline. I'd say a lot of it of a different timeline here than what you might expect. Again, they're still putting plans together because the football coach and the football organization, while certainly the centerpiece, has to fit into a broader reorganization of Virginia Tech's entire athletic department, and then how Virginia Tech athletics fits into the scheme of Virginia Tech, the university. Like, there's so much existential to me about Virginia Tech's place in the college football world. That's actually why I slightly disagree with Matt about whether Virginia Tech is a worse job than UCLA, to be frank, because at least UCLA is in the right neighborhood. Virginia Tech doesn't know what neighborhood they're going to be in 2030 when we probably realign again in some way, shape, or form in college sports. Heck, they don't even know if there's going to be the same neighborhood that they're in. So it's
Richard,
very,
are you
very
telling me the ACC is going to be gentrified, or is it going to get knocked down? Which one are you arguing for here?
Look, man, I live in Brooklyn. That's all I'll say.
I feel like
Matt,
sometimes we get Sesame Street on here. I feel like now we're getting Mr. Rogers. I want to know who's going to be in the neighborhood.
So, Richard, you throw out two names worth knowing at Virginia Tech. Can I throw out two names that just are not worth really paying attention to that people seem to be throwing out right now? So, Shane Beamer, Michael Vick. So, obviously everyone, when you go into this kind of process, you see the candidate lists and people throwing out names that could make sense for the job. And I'm sure you guys have seen the same thing in terms of people throwing out Michael Vick, who obviously prominent alum, Shane Beamer, who has the ties that he does to the school. I just don't see any scenario right now where either of those ends up being a legitimate possibility to be the next head coach at Virginia Tech.
I think with Michael Vick,
just killing dreams in Blacksburg right now.
I know. I think with Michael Vick specifically, because I did report on this for us on Sunday, kind of in the wake of everything happening. I think, first of all, Michael Vick is something of a booster wish cast pick. It's the feel good, takes us back to a different era. I think there are some people who could envision Michael Vick as a candidate who's similar to a Deion Sanders or an Eddie George. You put great coordinators around him and you allow him to be the front for fundraising, etc. That's kind of the vision there. I think overall, it's probably a little too early to say Michael Vick would be in the mix for not in the mix, I should say. It's a little early to say Michael Vick would be a leading candidate. I would not put him as a leading candidate at all. I think there is a thing that happens in these coaching searches that is a little bit under the radar, which is the courtesy interview. And there are times when guys get interviewed to, I don't want to say do a favor, but there are sometimes when guys get interviewed just to get interviewed and to get interviewed experience. I'm not saying that's going to happen to Michael Vick, but I do think there is a class of candidate for a job like Virginia Tech that I think Michael Vick could be in, if that's what we're talking about there.
I do want to throw a quick follow-up into that, though. I'm thinking of a situation. So when TCU hired Sonny Dykes, they had a number of finalists, and one of the finalists was one of those kind of throw-in candidates at the time. It was Deion Sanders, because of somebody on their board of regents that really wanted to push him. And Deion got a lot closer to getting that job than I think anybody would have anticipated, because he interviewed so well and ultimately, obviously ended up at Colorado the next year. But sometimes those throw-in candidates can make some headway. I'm not saying that's going to happen with Michael Vick. I'd be very surprised if it did, but it is something to keep in mind with those coaching searches.
And it depends what happens with the other candidates too, right? So it's like you think about Arkansas, you have people pushing for Sam Pittman. At the beginning of that search, he had no shot of getting it because they were swinging big. And then they miss. You start getting back around. You got a couple boosters that say, why don't we just give this guy a shot? Let's pour a bunch of money into the coordinators, whatever. So I don't disagree with anything that's been said here. But if Virginia Tech swings and misses on 10 guys and Michael Vick's still sitting there, at some point do they say, do we just hire this guy? And, that's kind of how you end up with Deshaun Foster, honestly. But at some point, you want the program hero and you say, let's just give this guy a shot, and then can end up badly.
The difference in just Deshaun had significant coaching experience prior to getting that opportunity, albeit as an assistant, where Michael does not have that level of coaching experience, even as an assistant to this point.
No, I agree with that. To your point about UCLA, we're going to talk about the Bruins after the break here on College Football Insiders.
When you need your sports news all the time,
we've got breaking news to bring to you.
CBS Sports HQ gives you a snapshot of all the sports that matter to you. When you need your sports in a snap, find it on CBS Sports HQ, streaming free anywhere you are.
Welcome back, College Football Insiders. If you're watching us on YouTube, like and subscribe. absolutely hit the bell for notifications so you know every time we go live. Also, we're in your podcast feeds, College Football Insiders, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. The other open job currently, or at least the job that came open on Sunday, UCLA, the Bruins. Similarly to Virginia Tech, there is something of an open question about the leadership structure of the search. In their press release, UCLA said, and I quote, Martin Germond and Executive Senior Associate Athletic Director Aaron Atkins will be aided in the search by a committee composed of accomplished sports and business executives and UCLA greats, close quote. How that works, we'll see. They have not announced the names yet. I think if I had to hazard a guess, a guy like, again, we're talking about UCLA greats, a guy like Troy Aikman probably ends up on that list. Troy Aikman was integral in getting Chip Kelly to UCLA back in 2017. Troy Aikman was part of what they called a full court press at the time to get Chip Kelly. So Troy Aikman is a name that I think is probably going to be connected to the search in one way or another. The other name that I think is really interesting is Casey Wasserman. Wasserman, he's a guy who his name's on the building at UCLA. He is one of, if not the biggest UCLA athletic donor, very integral in civic stuff in the city of Los Angeles, integral in getting the Olympics in Los Angeles in a few years, for instance. Matt, are you hearing anything about Casey's involvement either officially or unofficially with this search? I know he's got an open line of communication with obviously Martin Germond and UCLA's administration.
I mean, it seems like you and I have similar expectations. Probably the best way of summing it all.
Yeah, I just think that when you've got somebody like that, whether he's officially on the hiring committee, whether he's officially part of the search, at the end of the day, that's a guy that you consult about the moves that you make, John.
Yeah, and I mean, there are people I've talked to in the past who believe he's the reason why UCLA is in the Big Ten. Whether that's 100% accurate, I don't know. People believe he at least played a significant role in that playing out. So he's a big hitter for them, which is important. And I think it'll be interesting to see. I think, one of the questions people have is, what does UCLA want to be, right? And I think that goes back to what we're talking about earlier, Virginia Tech and finances. And, I think just think about Chip Kelly again. That was a big swing for them, and it didn't fully work out. It wasn't a failure, but it maybe didn't fully work out the way they wanted to. They clearly went with a cheaper bridge type hire, and Deshaun Foster didn't work out. It feels like there's a natural tendency after that happens to swing back around and swing bigger. Their chancellor, who started in January, is the guy who was at Miami when they hired Mario Cristobal. Some people in the industry think that might lead to them being bolder and swing bigger. I think what will be interesting, it's so early, it's hard to know, but this just feels like a job that potentially could be used as a leverage play for different people. There's going to be a lot of names mentioned, especially if you have a program that maybe is having a tough time when they start dangling big money. Everybody wants a piece of that so they can improve their own situations. There's a couple of candidates I can think of that have been mentioned out in those lists that I think that's exactly how it would play out if they ended up making a run at them. So we'll see there. But I think that UCLA is in such a interesting spot that it's going to be fascinating to see if they actually are willing to spend as much as there's kind of being rumored behind the scenes of industry people, and then what that actually ends up getting them.
Yeah, I'm interested in what the number looks like here, right? If you want to be playing ball, you're paying your head coach north of 7.5, or is this a job that the salary for the head coach ends up being something that's more 4 to 5 million? Staff pool. Are you going to get a staff pool that's close to 10 million? Or is it a staff pool that's going to be closer to 6 or 7, a staff hiring pool, meaning the money that you have to go to your assistant coaches? Where is UCLA at right now in the pecking order as far as willing to spend? It's a place that, man, you go back and look, they have not had a lot of football success to speak of in the last 30 years. I think there's this notion about UCLA, not as a power, nobody would say that, but as a factor in college football in the last 30 odd years. And that's just not really the case.
Yeah. And it comes back to something that Chris said also. So to add 2 more words to what Chris threw out with alignment, infrastructure, resources, 3 very important things for any prospective head coach. And when you have a situation like UCLA, where it's been 20 years since they finished a regular season with fewer than 3 losses, that shows me and also other people around the industry that there are issues there in terms of infrastructure, alignment, resources, regardless of who your head coach is. And something that resonated with me that had an industry source throw out about UCLA, that being the head coach at UCLA right now sounds better than what the reality of it actually is.
Yeah.
Than it actually is in reality.
Yeah.
Well, here's the
Another
thing, too.
reality.
I was just going to say, like, I mean, that money doesn't go as far out in LA than it does in some of these college towns around the country. So if you think about not only the resources that they don't have, but also like if you're making $7-8 million in a smaller college town, like, you know, it's not that big. UCLA, it sounds cool to say it, but like it's not going to go as far as
sounds like John Talty signing up to live in Starksville over Los Angeles is what I'm hearing. Like,
I mean, listen, I think Starkville's getting a Target soon. Things are on the way up.
Yeah, exactly.
That's when you know you made it, when you get a Target. I thought the same thing of Waxahachie, Texas when we got one growing up. So that's
please, fellas, it's pronounced Target. Another reality for both of these jobs, UCLA and Virginia Tech, is that the transfer portal is open for their players for the next 30 days. Virginia Tech's Dante Lovett announced that he will redshirt and intends to enter the transfer portal. But it's a reality for both programs. But Chris, I'll go to you first here on this. Does that actually mean anybody's going to hop in the transfer portal? I think there are a couple things at play here that people should consider. First and foremost is when you can literally enroll in school if you're one of these athletes, because yes, they do have to go to school. UCLA actually hasn't started classes because they're on the quarter system, and there aren't that many schools that are even like that. So Chris, are we expecting a massive portal exodus here in the next 30 days from either of these schools?
Yeah, we can spend a while on this topic, so I'll just try to keep it as quick as possible. One, no, not expecting a massive transfer exodus. Two, yes, they can enter the portal now. As soon as your school has a head coaching change, a 30-day window is triggered. That will remain in place when the transfer portal windows go to a single window as well. That rule is remaining in effect once that's likely passed tomorrow. Three, players cannot play for two schools in 1 year. I've had that question come up several times today from people in college football on the agent side, and I think some players are wondering the same things. You're not going to see somebody transfer from UCLA and end up at an SEC school and play this season. Like, you're laughing, Richard. I've literally spent probably 45 minutes of my day talking about this already today. That is a thing that is happening and a question that is being asked. And I think it's important to keep in mind logistically, and we can get on a little bit more of this because I think that's what's interesting. Every contract is different, right? Like every single player in this era of college football, be it NIL or rev share, a combination of both, has different language and structure in it. That includes how it's paid out, like when the payout money comes, like how often it comes, like is it front loaded, is it back loaded? And some players also have different structures in terms of like when that final payment gets paid or a buyout that's potentially in the deal. So when we're talking about an exodus, like you have to think about every individual player is a little different, and like every situation is a little different. But Matt can speak more to this, I'm sure too. He's been on the phone about a lot of these similar questions this week.
I'll say this. There will be players that decide to redshirt. There will be players from Virginia Tech and UCLA that enter the transfer portal. Based on conversations I've had, those players will primarily be backups or guys that are not playing. It's not like you're going to be seeing all conference or first round draft pick type players hitting the portal right now. That is just based on the communication that I've had during the course of the last couple of days. What I'm expecting to see in terms of players that ultimately make those decisions to redshirt and enter the portal. And again, you will see some of them.
Yeah. And I also think it's important to know, just theoretically, right? Like if you're going to a one portal window, and I'm not saying this is going to happen because game tape matters and like schools care about game tape, but there's a world where there's an advantage potentially if you're a player that can enter midseason to get in early, and essentially you're ahead of everyone else by a month in the portal when the portal opens January 2nd. The risk you take is you lose a full season of game tape. You potentially lose all the money you had scheduled to make in October, November, and December. And frankly, like most schools aren't going to keep you around if you decide to redshirt and just stay in school. So like there's a lot of factors that go into that. And I think every player is weighing that at the moment.
Yeah, I've seen rev share contracts for guys, and I've seen how they pay out. A lot of the times they pay out at the end of an individual month. They pay out monthly, but a lot of times the payout is the same for 11 months, and it bumps up in December. And it bumps up in December because they're trying to incentivize players to stay for bowl games. I've read a couple contracts that quite literally say December 31st or after the team's last game. So if they have a January bowl game, for instance, it keeps guys there. So there is a monetary concern that you may just be losing out on if you're a player who decides to go in the transfer portal. But John, it is something that is going to be inherent. I also think, frankly, we talk about backups, we talk about guys who aren't playing. How many players on both of these teams are really going to be deeply sought after, I think, is also a question, John.
Yeah, and I think what's also worth noting is that, like you said, we've dealt with some of the NIL stuff. This is our first year of rev share, and it's also, finally we have College Sports Commission where they're going to be involved in some of these things. And so in particular, if you're signed to a multi-year deal and you hit the portal, well, your new school might have to pay a buyout in terms of your previous deal. So there's different factors that I think we just haven't dealt with in the past when guys have moved from school to school. We've also seen things like the Xavier Lucas case where sometimes you can just unenroll and go somewhere else. So there's still some legal things, I think, trying to be figured out in terms of the enforceability of these different contracts. But I do think it's fascinating just, from talking to different people today too, there's some that's like our payments are the first of the month. There's some that it's the last of the month. There's some, like you said, that are the same amount every month. There's some that's more backloaded around the portal periods. It's just interesting that there's still not necessarily a kind of a common contract that everybody's using or common strategy. And there's probably some advantages, on the margins there. But I do think from talking to people this week, like we're at week 4, which is an interesting time where guys make that decision. Do I want a red shirt or not? And I do know that I think in particular, there's certain positions where, that might have a bigger factor, quarterback being one of them, and how you manage that. If it's a quarterback battle, do they both play this week? Do you try to make sure that both feel like they have a shot? There's some schools that are weighing that right now. Generally, like Matt said, it's going to be backups primarily and guys who are just frustrated with playing time. But there's certain guys that, if you feel like you should be the starter or you're not getting the time you want, you might pull the eject button after this week, and that's going to impact different programs.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, I was going to say, all that being said, like naturally going to still get questions about whether there will be starters from these two schools that end up hitting the portal. And like it goes beyond just fans. Schools, I'm sure we would love to see some different starter or high-level players enter the portal. And one of the main ones that have been questions about just in terms of UCLA is Nico at quarterback. And at this point, I'll just say, and things could always change, I would not anticipate whether it's Nico or any starter level or high-level player at not only UCLA, but Virginia Tech, once again, to end up redshirting and entering the portal right now.
I will.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting how that specifically shakes out with backups, especially because it meets, and Chris, we were talking about this. It's the fact that it's not just the 30-day window opening for these two, but it's also that week 4 factor when you do, frankly, see across college football, guys decide to shut it down.
Yeah, no question. And I see a question in the chat from Jim asking about seniors hitting the portal. And that's actually a really interesting point today. It depends. Seniors can actually be advantaged in this case if they're a senior who hasn't used their red shirt yet, right? Because if you're a senior, you were going to play, they most likely structured your contract in a way to where you get paid evenly and there's no big lump sum in December or transfer portal penalty because they expected you to play and then graduate and then you're done. But let's say a senior's played 3 or 4 games at one of these 2 schools and they have a red shirt to use. Like that's a scenario where it could be really advantageous for them to take that red shirt year, step back, and then get another kind of slice of cake next year and one more rev share NIL payment. And not most players aren't going to do that if they're playing. Like ultimately the NFL is the goal, but there are situations where like, let's say you're like your guy that gets snaps but isn't starting, like that can make a lot of sense for you at these schools where you're going to have options in the winter. So that's certainly a factor.
we're going to hit a quick break, but it's advantageous to you to stick with us here on the College Football Insiders.
You can always count on Sundays with the NFL on CBS and Paramount Plus. So even if you can't count on accurate expiration dates,
that is a rookie mistake,
or people appreciating your fashion sense,
Jim, the crowd is not on board here.
you can always count on Sundays with the NFL on CBS, streaming on Paramount Plus.
Glad we wear our good jerseys.
Yeah. Welcome back to the College Football Insiders. Fellas, we got two Big Ten showdowns involving two of the more interesting quarterback transfer and freshman quarterback situations in college football. First, we'll start with Michigan and Nebraska, 3:30 on Saturday. Dylan Raiola at Nebraska, Bryce Underwood at Michigan. No Sharon Moore, won't be on the sidelines for the second straight game. Biff Poggi will be on the sidelines, sleeves intact, coaching the Wolverines. He did say his Labrador Retriever could coach Bryce Underwood because the guy has so much talent. I tend to agree. Chris, you had a conversation with Dylan Raiola earlier for a story that you're working on about this massive matchup. Also inherent, what did Dylan have for lunch today?
I know this was my biggest takeaway of the article. He said it wasn't much. It was just a steak and Brussels sprouts. And I'm like, dude, that's like a nice Friday out for me. So they're living right in Nebraska. But I think there's a lot of optimism around Nebraska about this season. I'll have the story out later this week for CBS. But part of what I was talking to him about is the concerted effort Nebraska made to sort of build around him this offseason. John wrote a really interesting story 2 weeks ago about players being able to exercise some pressure on their schools to kind of get what they want out of the portal. And I wouldn't say Dylan Raiola necessarily did that, but I think there was certainly a realization in Nebraska that you need to take advantage of Dylan Raiola where you get him. And that's why they went out and got a guy like Dane Key from Kentucky, the receiver, a 4-star recruit, signed 2 very expensive offensive linemen in addition to 2 other receivers. And I think you're seeing some of those results play out on the field early on. And that Nebraska offense is going to be under the microscope against Michigan, because you went out and paid Dylan Raiola, you went out and signed Dylan Raiola to win games like this, and this is an opportunity for Nebraska at home to make a really big statement on CBS, by the way, like important to know.
It's important to know. Thank you, Chris.
I'm a company
John,
man.
I appreciate that. John, in the other matchup, the other Big Ten matchup, I should say, Illinois versus Indiana. Fernando Mendoza, transfer quarterback in from Cal. Producer Aaron is okay with that because of what JKS is doing at Cal this season. Shout out. But he's playing Luke Altmaier, who is one of those who stayed type of player. Got a lot of pops from the transfer portal as well. But as Chris reported actually earlier this spring, he decided to stay. Him and his father decided that Illinois was the right place for him. So you've got the yin and yang there of modern college football. You have this transfer portal quarterback who's really talented and a guy who stayed with his program to run it back with a team that could be a dark horse for the Big Ten championship.
Yeah, I got a chance to spend time with both these guys in the offseason. And they're both just very thoughtful kids. I guess kids is an old man thing for me to say. They're both very thoughtful young men. I don't know how to put that. But they're smart. I think that they both went about their decisions, both for Luke to stay, Fernando to go to Indiana very thoughtfully. I think there was a lot of, things that they thought about. And like Chris said, both of them thought about what are my surrounding pieces. And I think that they're 2 of the best quarterbacks in the Big Ten. I know that, Richard, you're a big believer in Mendoza the way I am. Like, people think this is a guy who, especially with some of the other top QBs coming into the season, not having the greatest start, I think he's a potential first-round pick if he keeps, elevating his play up. But I also think it's a very important Big Ten game. These are 2 teams that top 20 teams. Big Ten feels very top-heavy in some ways, but there's going to potentially be that 4th, 5th team that will have a shot to be in the mix for the CFP. I think the winner of this game could be potentially in a good position. I know Illinois in particular has some tough games coming up, but I'm just excited to see how these 2 guys compete against probably the toughest competition they've faced so far. But Mendoza's great. I think you have to pick somebody that you're a believer in. Last year for me, as Matt can attest to, was on Genty very early on in the year, begging our editor Trey Scott to let me write about him. Mendoza's my guy this year. I'm all in. And so we'll see if he delivers for me on Saturday.
Continues to put himself more on the NFL radar. So John hit the nail on the head with that. This clearly will be the biggest test so far for Indiana. It'll be the first P4 team that they face. But in terms of Fernando Mendoza, yes, it was Indiana State, but his last game, so going back to last week, 19 of 20, 270 yards, 6 total touchdowns. I don't care who you're going against. That's impressive as far as the stat line. And you just saw some of the characteristics there as far as throws that he made that give you an idea of why people at the next level and NFL scouts are as enthusiastic about him and as intrigued with him as what they are. And then just to shift back to the other game real quick with Michigan and Nebraska. One of the interesting things last week with Bryce Underwood in terms of that matchup with Central Michigan was it was the first real look at Bryce in terms of what he can do as a runner and utilizing his athleticism to go along with just what he can do from a passing standpoint. So ended up with in excess of 100 rushing yards to go along with what he did throwing, which is just another wrinkle with him that we all knew about and knew about Bryce's athleticism, but it was the first time that he had put that on display since getting to Michigan and on a Saturday. From Nebraska standpoint, touched on Dylan Raiola obviously already, says something that definitely helps him is just the continued evolution of Emmett Johnson at running back. So we talk about some of the portal pickups for Nebraska, like Dane Key. Something important from a portal perspective for them was keeping Emmett Johnson from leaving via the portal. So he entered, ultimately withdrew, and now through the first 3 games has in excess of 300 rushing yards, which is providing a nice complement to what Dylan Raiola, Dane Key, etc. are doing in the passing game.
We continue inside the insiders here. Chris mentioned this earlier in the show. He talked about changes to the transfer portal window. This is something that was announced a few weeks ago as maybe probably happening, coming. You don't always know until it's official with NCAA rule changes. But Chris, kind of take us through what's happening here and its effect here on the transfer portal cycle in December.
Well, Matt and I are going to get to sleep a little bit more in the spring, so we're excited about that. But it's going to be pretty significant. This is likely to be passed tomorrow, and it'll essentially eliminate the spring transfer portal window, and it'll shrink the winter window to 10 days. So I believe it opens January 2nd under the proposed rules. And again, it has to be passed tomorrow and will close January 11th. But there are some significant changes in this way, particularly like with grad transfers. In the previous era, grad transfers could enter the portal at any time, starting October 1st, all the way through the end of the spring portal window. Now they're essentially going to be in the same window as everyone else, and they have to go in from January 2nd to January 11th. So it's going to slow traffic down a little bit in the portal. There will be exceptions for this. We talked about earlier the 30-day transfer window for players whose head coaches leave. There will also be an exception for players participating in the postseason starting on a certain date. So you're going to see players transfer outside of those windows. But overall, like, this is a pretty significant change to the sport. And messaging with a lot of people today, I think a lot of people in the personnel and the coaching space are excited about additional stability. Essentially, you don't have to protect your roster twice in a year. Like, you don't have to negotiate with your players twice in a year moving forward. And that certainly shifts the way college football has operated the last couple of years, because that has been a constant struggle for teams. You lock a player up and he comes back to the table asking for more, and like, good for the players, they're using their leverage, but moving forward, they won't have that spring portal as a leverage point.
And
yeah,
we saw guys who, sorry, Richard, we saw guys who transferred to place and then transferred again in the spring, and that's off the table in a big way now.
Yeah, the double transfer. Yeah, the double transfer was crazy. My question is this, though, for you, Chris. Does it really stop the consistent and continued effective renegotiation process that a lot of these guys have, where they come once and twice and 3 times, sometimes during a football season, to get a raise?
On paper, yes, because you only have to get through that January 11th date to prevent it from happening. But like, we all know, like, there's a way around these rules. Like, we saw it happen with Xavier Lucas. We saw it happen with Jake Retzlaff. Like, there are ways for players to get around the standard rules and practices of college football and how the transfer portal works. But yeah, for the most part, it's going to be easier for schools to deal with that. Yeah, you might have to deal with it a couple times in December because tampering is occurring and players get offers and they go back to the table asking for more. But I think a lot of schools are relieved that they can get rid of that in the spring and they can just focus on spring practice. And there's no mechanism for players to create that leverage outside of just unenrolling and showing up somewhere else.
I think the thing that I have come away with over and over again with college football over the last 5+ years is that every time we think there's a solution, it props up 5 new problems. It feels like whack-a-mole in so many ways. And so similar to Chris, like people are excited about it. It's something that a lot of people have wanted for a long time, head coaches, personnel people, but there just always seems to be unintended consequences anytime college football tries to do anything to fix its problems. And so I don't even know what those are yet. I'm sure there's some very smart person out there who's already thinking of ways to bend the system to their will and find loopholes. To Chris's point, we've seen guys find a way of just unenrolling and showing up at new schools. We'll probably find even more creative solutions from that. It feels, as much as I would love it to just be the solution that fixes everything, it just feels like something else will pop up. And when we're doing a show like this in April, we're be like, man, I can't believe we didn't think of this, but this is the new thing that everybody's doing. I don't know. Maybe that's pessimistic to me, but I just feel like that's played out over and over again in the last 5 years.
John, I'm gonna get really mad at you if we're here in April and there's a loophole created because you put that in the universe. So I just need you to know that you're gonna get an angry.
Well, if you put it out in the universe, maybe it stops it from happening. Maybe I'm like preventing it from happening by talking about it. I don't know.
I appreciate that. Reverse psychology on the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
Last thing from us today on the College Football Insiders. An interesting job posting came up yesterday with the Southeastern Conference. Basically, the SEC is hiring an associate commissioner for football. Now, fellas, I was under the understanding that former Ole Miss and Duke head coach David Cutcliffe was essentially doing this job for the SEC office. The job listing, and I'll paraphrase here, but will provide leadership and oversight for football operations, policy, stakeholder engagement for the Southeastern Conference. Key areas of responsibility include football competition standards, policy advisement on national governance issues like NIL, transfer policies, CFP, and employment models, enhancement of officiating and scheduling practices, and advancing student-athlete welfare and program integrity. So again, I thought this was something that David Cutcliffe had been doing, but John, apparently not.
Yeah, I mean, let me start. I've actually already officially nominated Matt Zenitz for this job. We'll see how that plays out. This might be his swan song on this podcast as he takes over that job. But what I thought that as well, Richard. And I think after talking to some different people, it feels like David's role is a bit more informal. I think he is a great resource for football coaches. He's obviously been doing it for a long time and someone who evokes a lot of respect from different coaches in that room. This is a more formalized role. I think from talking to a couple of people, there's a belief that either they want or might need someone that has a bit more of a legal background. And so that would eliminate some of the bold-faced names that you might think could be up for this job, excluding Matt Zenitz, of course. So we'll see. I think it's an interesting time. For the SEC, they obviously just lost William King, which I think for our viewers is very in the weeds, but someone who played a very important role from a legal standpoint for the SEC for a long time, was very involved in constructing those rev share contracts that we've been talking about in this episode. So this is separate from that, but there's some components that are mixed in. So it's an important job for the SEC and someone who will attract quality candidates. I just would not expect Nick Saban or Steve Spurrier in this role from how it's been described to me.
John, I know other conferences, like I know the Big Ten, for instance, AJ Eads is kind of the football guy, but is he similar to this role, or is this more of like on the legal end? As far as I understand it, Eads is kind of more on like the football ops specific way with the job.
Right. Yeah, I think it's kind of a combination of multiple different roles for them. And they have different people more on the legal and compliance side, obviously. And then, they have sports specific people like AJ, as you mentioned, for football. They've got Brad in basketball and down the line. So I think it's a little bit different in that regard. But it's also one of those things, and we've been talking about coaching searches, but sometimes you see what's out there and you might end up hiring someone who's a little bit different from how you thought it was going to end up being. But I definitely think that hiring got attention from people. And I have had multiple people text me basically asking, like, who are they going for this job, or who do you think might be qualified for this type job?
What does this mean, do we think, for Greg Sankey kind of overall as far as his job responsibilities, but also, quite frankly, succeeding Greg Sankey whenever it is Greg decides to hang it up?
Well, I don't even think you knew this, but I do have a story coming out, I think hopefully next week, on Charlie Hussey, who is the number 2 in the SEC, who is kind of viewed by different people as potentially the heir apparent to the SEC. He's also been heavily involved in both their media rights, which is something that is going to continue to play obviously an important role, and also in the playoff expansion discussion. He's been taking the lead and working with the Big Ten as they go through those different things. So he's an important person that I think the average person does probably not know, but has a very important role. And I don't know if we'll end up talking about it next week, but the college football playoff commissioners are meeting again next week in Chicago for the playoff discussion. I know everybody loves that stuff.
I'm sure their discussions will be deeply productive, and we will definitely absolutely get some clarity about whatever it is that they're worried about the future of college sports, as always. Chris Hummer, John Talty, Matt Zenitz, thank you, as always, for joining me, College Football Insiders. I'm your host, Richard Johnson. We will be back on Thursday with another episode.